Hey guys, this is Jason at Chino Valley Muffler and Performance. We're getting ready to install the REIKA 2-inch suspension system on this 2020 Subaru Forester. We're going to be using a 19mm socket along with our wheel lock. If your vehicle does not have a wheel lock, you can go ahead and use a 19mm socket to pull the wheel off. And we're going to start with that. All right, so next we're going to be taking off the upper sway bar end link. You're going to be using a 17mm socket. Sometimes these will spin, so you might need to use an Allen wrench, which is going to be a T6 along with a 17mm wrench for it to be able to be backed out. Start with that. And that one came off easy. Set that on the side, and you're gonna take your sway bar, disconnect it from there, and leave it to the side. After that, we're gonna be removing the ABS wire, and you're just gonna be detaching it from the pins, so it's got some slack in it, so it doesn't pull down on the sensor itself. And you can use a clip remover for that. All right, so next we're going to be taking off the brake line from the actual strut itself to give us a little bit of slack, because once this strut wants to come out, the whole lower control arm assembly is going to pull down on that. And that's going to be with a 12mm socket. All right, next we're going to be removing these two 19mm cam adjuster bolts, and you're going to want to mark the top one before you loosen the bolt to make sure you get that back in the correct way, I guess you would say it. So it's easier to align the vehicle after the fact. So we're just going to go ahead and mark this line here, and it's going to correspond with this line coming up off the strut itself. We're going to be using a 19mm socket on the impact, and then a 19 3/4 on the backside. And then we're going to be loosening up the bottom one as well. And these are a little bit tough sometimes, so you might need a breaker bar to actually break them loose. All right, set it aside. Now when taking out these cam bolts, this entire hub assembly and lower control arm is going to drop out of the way. So then we'll be able to pull the strut out once we loosen the top bolts. And taking out the lower one, I'd recommend using a dead blow instead of using an actual hammer, so you don't ruin the threads on the bolt itself. All right, once that bolt is loose, the spindle assembly and lower control arm will drop out of the way. Just make sure it doesn't drop completely. You might want to use a small jack stand or jack underneath it so it doesn't pull the actual CV axle out of the transmission here. You can leave that laying to the side, and we're going to go focus on the top now. All right, so we're going to start with loosening up these three 14mm bolts on the top strut. You can use an extra set of hands by simply holding the strut below, or reach over the fender well and grab it from underneath. We're going to crack them loose first, all three of them. And then the strut is actually loose from down below, so it will fall if you don't have somebody holding it. and set these aside because you will be using them later. And there it goes. Now the strut's out of the vehicle, and we can begin the lift process. All right, so now that we have the strut out of the vehicle, we're going to be installing the spacer, and you're going to want to look for the spacer in the kit. That, since we're on the passenger side, it's going to have a small P in the corner here. The logo is going to actually face the grille of the vehicle, so if you were standing in front of the vehicle, you're going to look at the spacer as if it sits like this. So we're going to make sure that the strut is in the correct position as it would be in the vehicle, and we're going to mount the actual spacer as it would sit forward facing. Then you're going to apply your factory 14mm bolts onto the spacer, and you're going to be torquing those to 30 foot-pounds. All right, now it's ready to be reinstalled in the vehicle. All right, so now we're going to be putting the spring back in, and you're going to feed it up into the factory mounting holes. Get all three nuts on just snug, enough to be able to align the spindle back, and then we'll go back and retorque the bolts once everything's connected. All right, so now that we've got the strut back up into place loosely, we can realign the spindle with the strut, and we're going to be putting the cam bolt in first, which is the funny looking one. Once we've got that in there loosely, we're going to throw the bottom one in. And then you're going to be throwing your washer back on the cam bolts. Guiding those nuts on. And now this is the time when we're going to take that little line that we marked before and match it up with the line on the strut itself and tighten. All right, so now that we got the cam bolt in and the lower bolt in, we're going to be torquing these down to 95 foot-pounds. All right, now that we got them snug, we get the torque wrench out and go to 95 foot-pounds. All right, so next we're going to be installing the brake line. Originally it is mounted below the nut there. We're going to be mounting it above for extra length due to the actual lift itself. So you're going to use the same little 12mm bolt that you used before. After we got the brake line in nice and snug, we're going to go back to the ABS on the other side of this strut here and plug them back into the original mounting points. Now that we have the ABS line in place, we're going to be reconnecting the sway bar with the supply bracket and hardware. You're going to want to disconnect the other side of the sway bar, which we've already done, to give you ease of use on movement to get the sway bar back into place. So we're going to start with a nut and a flat washer, or I'm sorry, a bolt and a flat washer, and these are going to be orientated in that manner, flat against the original sway bar length. And this is going to be a 19mm. All right, now that we have the sway bar in-link mount in on the strut supplied in the kit, we're going to use this spacer onto the end of the sway bar, and it's going to go right into the top hole there, and you're going to use the factory mounting hardware for the in-link itself. And we're going to be using the 17 millimeter again to tighten that bad boy down. Now that we have the sway bar in-link back together, we're going to go back up top and tighten the 3 14 millimeter bolts that are holding the strut. All right, now we're going to be torquing these bad boys up top, the 3 14 millimeters down to 30 foot-pounds. All right, guys, so now that we're done with the front suspension, we can move on to the rear, and we're going to start with tearing apart the inside of the trunk to get to the upper bolts of the struts. And we're going to start with basically just a clip removal tool, and everything else is going to pop out pretty easy. And then you'll see now there's going to be 2 clips that just need to be popped out, and then this panel will come out as well. All right, now that side panel's out, we have full access to the upper rear strut bolts. All right, guys, so now that we got the trunk all taken apart, we're going to move on to taking off the wheel and tire again. All right, guys, so now that we've got the rear tire off, we're going to be putting the jack underneath this lower control arm and just giving it a little bit of tension to give it some support under here. And we're going to be moving on to the next step, which is going to be loosening these 2 upper control arm bolts. We're not going to be taking them out, we're just going to be loosening them up, and that's going to give us a little better movement up and down. Also the lower control arm bolt that goes to the chassis, and then we're going to start with getting these 2 main bolts off to get this strut out. So let's get to it. This is going to be a 17 millimeter wrench and 17 millimeter socket on either side. All right, so we just loosened those up. We're not going to take them all the way out. They are a bit of a bear at the startup, so you might need maybe a longer ratchet or breaker bar. Let's get underneath here and get this lower. All right, now that one's loose, so we are going to go ahead with removing the bolt and nut assembly that is attached to the spindle and the lower control arm. And then we're going to be taking off the bolt that holds the strut to the lower control arm. All right, now that we have everything loosened up, so we have a little bit of play, we're going to be pulling this brake line off of the spindle. That's going to be a 12 millimeter bolt. All right, now that we have that loose, we've got some free space to work with. We're going to lower the jack slightly just to take the load off of the suspension here. That way we can get the spindle, the lower spindle nut off, which is going to be this one. We've already taken the nut off. All right, that bolt is out, and now our spindle is free from our lower control arm. Now we can go ahead and take off our bolt holding the actual strut on. And we could lower the jack, move it out of the way, and then we'll be able to lower the lower control arm out of the way Okay, now that we got the jack out of the way, the lower control arm literally just falls right out. And now this strut is just being held on by the 2 upper bolts in the back of the vehicle. So let's make our way over there. All right, now that we are back in the back of the vehicle, you're gonna have maybe a friend or somebody to help you out by holding the strut while you undo these 2 14mm nuts holding the strut assembly to the back of the car. All right, now we got those 2 upper 14mm nuts holding this strut in, and it just slides right out and easy. All right, guys, now that we're back at the bench with the strut and our lift spacer here, we're gonna be putting this bad boy on. What you're gonna wanna do is just, they don't have a right or left, so they're just gonna go right on. But you only need to put it on a little way so you can get that nut in there and start to thread it on both sides here. And you're gonna wanna torque these to the same 30 that we did the front. All right, guys, now we're back at the vehicle with the strut. We got our new spacer in, and we're gonna be putting it in the same way we took it out. We're gonna need a friend probably inside the back of the vehicle to go ahead and thread on a few threads so we can get it up in there. All right. Now it's nice in there, it's loosely in there. We're gonna go basically backwards and pull this lower control arm up to the strut and get our first bolt into the strut and lower control arm assembly. For now, we're just going to hand tighten this so we have a little bit of accessibility. Once we do that, now we're going to need our jack back underneath this lower control arm to support it and push up on the strut so we can connect it back to the spindle. All right, guys, now that we've got all the bolts back in, nothing's torqued down yet. We still want to get the car back on the wheels and tires, let everything kind of settle, then we'll go back and torque. We're gonna move on to the brake line, and this is kind of a big one. As you can see, once I put this back into the factory location, we're gonna have tension on the line, and this is not even at full droop yet. So what we wanna do is, this is one of the only kits that comes with an actual brake line extension of 2 inches, and that's gonna give it a lot of sway. So this bracket is gonna pertain and go towards the back of the vehicle. So the factory mounting bolt you're gonna use on the bottom portion of it, and that's gonna be the same 12mm that it was before. And then in the kit also comes with some more hardware here, and this will go on the back side here. All right, so now we're ready to put the tire back on the vehicle so we can get the whole suspension to suck back in the vehicle. Then we'll go back inside and tighten the 2 14mm on top of the strut. All right, guys, now we got the car back on its tires. We're gonna go ahead and tighten up the 2 14mm up here in the trunk. We're going to torque these down to a 30 foot-pounds torque on that, and now we're going to put the trunk back together. All right, guys, now we got the 14 millimeter bolts on top of the struts torqued down to 30 foot-pounds. We're gonna put the trunk assembly back together, which is gonna include all this plastic foam. The vehicle back up on the lift, and we're going to go ahead and torque down all our suspension bolts that we loosened up when we were taking it apart to 95 foot-pounds. It's going to be with a 17 millimeter socket here. All right, guys, that was the installation video for the REIKA 2-inch suspension system. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. As you can see, you can do it with basic hand tools in your garage, and it turns out great. Thanks for watching.